When people try to make the argument, this modern argument that's just surfaced, that is everywhere, any commentary you read, most of them will say, well, the Jewish people at this time, Moses the Jew. Please, listen to what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is out of the Bible we're all reading. So what we're looking at here is the introduction, if you will, to Moses' lineage. So Exodus 2 starts with, there went out a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Now this is on the backdrop, and this is your introduction to Moses. This is on the heels of what comes before in the first chapter. Basically, that it's described by the midwives that the Hebrew women are lively. I'm going to let you think about what that might exactly mean. Use your imagination. But there is a focus right there in the opening of the first verse of the second chapter, which is that a man of the house of Levi. So we know something definitive, that Levi obviously stems from the original children of Jacob, who became known as Israel. If you look in the first chapter, the opening chapter of Exodus, now these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. And I love the fact that it doesn't say Israel to keep it clear, Jacob who became Israel, right? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. I'm just stopping right there to say this is going to talk about all of the children that Jacob had, who then he becomes Israel, and his immediate children. We might refer to them as just simply his children that become clans or tribes, and they keep populating and having more children. So if you keep reading through all of the names of the sons or the children of Israel or Jacob, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Joseph died, and all his brethren and all that generation, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So that gives you kind of a bridge between Genesis and Exodus of how they ended up in Egypt. They were not initially in bondage, but because of Joseph, remember, famine in the land, and all the family ventures into Egypt because of the famine, only to discover their long-lost brother. That's another whole story. If you don't know it, read it on your own. But the reason for pointing this out is that clearly, even the way things are organized sometimes in the Bible, if you're just reading it, you go, what logic is there? But it's an introduction. This first chapter introduces you to the fact that the children of Israel, the sons and offspring of Jacob, were in Egypt and were incredibly fruitful, and they are just reproducing like rabbits and having a lot of children, all right? So that's why it says they waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. And then, of course, we read that there was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and this begins a whole kind of twist in the narrative, which is literally just a fulfillment of what God said to Abraham back in Genesis. But the reason for pointing out this beginning, we'll call it identification of the sons of Jacob, is because Levi is right there, named as the third. And then in the opening of the second chapter, there went out a man of the house of Levi and took a wife of the daughter of Levi. And if you turn to Exodus 6 and the 20th verse, you find out the names of Moses' parents. And Amram took Jehoshaphat, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. You notice Miriam's not even mentioned there. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. Now, just as a footnote, by the way, I want to just point something out. This is why sometimes I will say things and people just begin getting very angry with me, and they're like, wow, how could you say that when I have addressed this already? this Bible is patriarchal, not matriarchal, okay? It is completely focused on the male lineage. We know that Miriam is the sister of Moses and Aaron, yet she's not even mentioned. So this is why, when I'll address this just briefly later, when people want to make the case about the matriarchal lineage is more important, it wasn't to God, and to the writers who wrote, it wasn't even in their inspiration. This was a male-dominated world. Forget about the King James translators, that's a whole different ball of wax. But at the time of this writing, the only thing that was really important was if, say, the mother, like Sarai, if it fit into the narrative, she's mentioned. If it doesn't, not mentioned, not even relevant. And don't take that the wrong way. This is the way this book was written. So when people make these really modern arguments about which came first, the chicken or the egg, or matriarchal or patriarchal, all you have to do is read that and see with the missing element of Miriam, it becomes clear that we don't really have a focus on anything else but the male lineage. Now, the reason for pointing this part of this out, Amram marries Jehoshabed, his father's sister's wife, is if you look at the family tree, and if you were to try and write it out from any part of the Bible, it really looks confusing. So just simply put, Amram married his father's sister. Okay, just put that there for just a second. So we know that out of this family, not Moses, but Aaron will essentially and eventually become the priestly line. And that's going to be kind of important a little bit later in this message. But for the reason of basically recounting, this is kind of what's happening right now as we're in the second chapter. There is no priesthood, okay? Would you all agree there's no priesthood yet? Yes. Good, thank God. There is no law given as of yet. Yeah? Yes. No commandments, and no one is yet labeled by any religious nomenclature. Would you agree with all of that? Yes. Hallelujah. So there are no titles. There may be titles attached to pagan people, which I'll point out in a minute, but there is no Judaism or Jewish labeling at this point. Why? Judaism does not yet exist. And I told you I would deal with this. I'm not going to deal with this completely today, but I'm just going to say it just to put a footnote. See, many people tend to conflate the word Hebrew, Israelite, and Judaism, and they make it just one and the same, just kind of a homogenize. It's not at all. Now, there are many mentions in Exodus of Hebrews. Just take a look for a second. If you're reading the same book I'm reading, the king of Egypt, which is Pharaoh, spake to the Hebrew midwives. Okay, there's one reference there. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women. And then again, you'll read down, and the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively. Whatever that means, take that to mean whatever that means, all right? And you'll read again, for example, there's other passages where, for example, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And they said, the God of the Hebrews hath met with us. So you're going to have these references in many places of Hebrew women, the God of the Hebrews, and even a reference to the land of the Hebrews. But make no mistake about this. If you read this carefully, you're going to see that these are people mostly from the outside addressing. So Pharaoh is talking and saying to these women who do the work of the midwives, the Hebrew women are. This is not God speaking about his people. This is coming out of Pharaoh's mouth. So there is something really important to begin looking at. The first thing I'm going to say is, to me, is axiomatic. It's self-evident. Let's talk about these words and try and isolate them a little bit. So, for example, I've heard some things that just make you go, okay, whatever. I don't even know I can deal with this. But, for example, today's modern Israelis, they speak Hebrew. And like any language, Hebrew has evolved. So take a person like me, I can read and write modern Hebrew very poorly. It's more of a cursive type script language, but I'm very proficient in biblical Hebrew, okay? So the language has evolved, it has changed, and much like, if you think about it, much like the English before Chaucer or Shakespeare, you all saw that wonderful Wycliffe Bible that's incredibly hard to read because it looks nothing like English, right? So every language has its morphing and its shaping and so forth. So we never hear the current language spoken in that land as the Israelite language, right? It's the Hebrew tongue. People say the Hebrew language, the Hebrew tongue. You don't say the Israelite. That's not even said. And anybody who says that would be saying something very incorrect. So linguistic identification for us, for this purpose, is a very late thing. Just like identification of Jews with Israelite, that is a modern conflation that began to take place right here in the scriptures. It begins after the fall of Samaria. So if you are reading this book, please don't take my word for this, all right? Just don't go, oh, well, she said. I want you to read it. Go find it and look it up because I'm getting tired of people arguing with me. There was no such thing. There are references to Judahites in the Hebrew writing. There are references to the people, the inhabitants of Judah that are called Judahites that as time goes on will become Judeans that will become Jewish. But it's not like people think when they're reading this book of Exodus and all of a sudden the imagery is that everybody wore a beanie and sepis or payas, the curly hair that goes by the side of the temple. Sorry, that's not the way it worked. It didn't even exist yet. God is just starting to give a prescribed way, we'll call them guidelines, when the law is given. Why did God have to give 10 commandments? And by the way, the law is much more than 10 commandments, but why? Think of this. You, as a stranger going to a foreign land, you might actually want to get familiar with the laws of the land before you start driving or doing business or whatever it is. This was God's way of putting out a roadmap after all this period of seeing the behavior, the inability, people didn't know God. So you have to kind of put these things in perspective. And then you have something else that happens. A careful study of the Bible alongside archaeology finds it makes it very necessary to distinguish between Israelite and Hebrew. And this may shock some people, what I'm going to say, but they are actually sometimes mentioned as separate and distinct people. And I will show you. So I don't want anybody throwing anything my way right now. Just hear me out. And when I've shown you, then you can do whatever you want. So in the book of Genesis, in the table of nations, if we don't touch that for a second, all right? Just don't even go there for a second. The word Hebrew that is often applied to Israelites outside of the table of nations. We read in Exodus, for example, that the children of Israel, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, did not depart out of Egypt alone, but they departed with a mixed multitude, suggesting that there were non-Israelites with them. And that actually, it's not like, oh, wow, that's something I need to know, but it's that little small detail. And then you start to ask, why would God put that in there like that, right? So just for the sake of clarity, an Israelite at this point in the book simply means those who are descendants of the man Jacob / Israel, all right, who had many children. I'm just going to keep reinforcing this because it can't obviously be said enough. So let's just, for the sake of those people who just can't get this, let's just say that Jacob's name was Bill. They would be called the children of Bill, or maybe the children of William, but it is his children. So don't conflate land, which does not yet exist with that name labeled to it. Right now, the land exists as Hanan, Canaan. So don't conflate and think Israel and think the people, the land. We're talking about the descendants, the children, the offspring of Jacob, all right? So a nation does not yet exist, and there is, again, no land for these people as yet referred to as Israel. So you've got, just like I've taught on this before, just like Jerusalem did not yet exist with that name, it existed as Jebus before it was Jerusalem. So it's important to have these pieces of information, otherwise you just kind of end up playing what I call the shift game and nothing is clear. The period that we are looking at in Exodus, from Genesis to Exodus, is a time when Egypt controlled Canaan, and that's super important to know. Why? Because there are many warlike tribes that fought amongst themselves, and we see, for example, if you want clarity, Egypt rules Canaan during the late Bronze Age, and that land is ruled probably until around 1130 BC by the Egyptians. At that time, there is a decline and other events which are historical, which can be chronicled. Now, at this particular time, the place we're talking about, we're not looking at anything but a people who were in bondage, who have been basically delivered out of Egypt's bondage. They're wandering in the desert, and they could have probably made it there in a much shorter period of time, but God basically was making them do the old okey doke and wander around because they were just disobedient and they would not heed God's instructions. So, what I just referenced then, if you go back to look, it will become clear to you that there must be another meaning as to why Pharaoh, in most of these, it's Pharaoh saying the Hebrew women or the land of the Hebrews. There must be a reason for that. See, the Hebrews themselves did not reference themselves as Hebrews, but the outsiders reference them that way. And you've got to read that to make clear that that's what that is saying. Now, there is a reference, because you might say, what am I talking about? There is a reference. I'll just say, write it down, look it up later. There's a reference in Genesis 40:15, the land of the Hebrews. But where were they? They were, at that time, in Dothan. And if you look at a Bible map, Dothan is kind of north and just slightly south of Beth Shan. So if you want to kind of examine that, and then we could equally make the case that once they wandered into Egypt, back there in Genesis, they lived in the land of Goshen. So you gotta read this with great scrutiny. This land that people keep talking about and conflating, which does not yet exist, was without political structure. So the Egyptians ruled. These children of Israel do not have a political structure in place that does not yet exist. There is no unity in the land, because if you read, you're going to read that in the land of Canaan there were Perizzites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amalekites, Midianites. They were all there in that land. So there is no political union. And the God of the Hebrews is used in a dialogue, as I just said. Pharaoh, a stranger outside, is labeling it that way. They never called that land the land of the Hebrews. Just, you've got to put that in perspective. There's another statement in Genesis 43:32 that says that the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews. This was a social distinction, not a national distinction. Social. And why do I say that? Because if you read in Genesis 46:34, it says every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So it had more to do with the fact they just didn't like these people than some national concept that a lot of people want to go in there and start parsing and picking apart. It's not like that. The shepherds being Jacob and his whole entire clan, and I'll just kind of touch on this a little bit. If you remember, I've done many teachings on the Hyksos during that period, and there's a long stretch at places like Avaris and other mentions in Goshen of these shepherd kings, shepherd rulers. And all you've got to do is think back to when Joseph rose to prominence, second in command to Pharaoh with all of his family around him. These were shepherds, they dealt with livestock, and they were, at least Joseph was, elevated to a very high, prominent position. So we have to be careful about examining the word Hebrew. It seems to have been, as I said, widely used by the Egyptians and the Philistines when making reference to Asiatic or nomadic foreigners. So there is no, people read a lot into this, but I want you to look at something with me that will make my point very clear. If you can, please turn with me to 1 Samuel 14. And I want you to take a look at something, because some of you are probably going, huh? What's she saying? So, in 1 Samuel 14, you're going to read that we've got two things going on here. But in the 21st verse of the 14th chapter of 1 Samuel, moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. Did you just read that? Because when you're doing it like that, it shows you that somehow there is a distinction between these two people. You want to read that again? Moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel, which had hid themselves in Mount Ephraim. So clearly, whoever's writing for Samuel sees the distinction. And just, you say, well, is that an accident? Turn back just one page. Just turn back one chapter, the 13th chapter. And if you start reading in the 13th chapter, you're going to see something. 6th verse, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. For as for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Again, a separate mention. And I think this becomes somewhat important. It seems like as you progress through the Bible, there begins to be less and less references to the people known as the Hebrews. There is, for example, a reference in Jonah 1:9, where the men of the ship asked Jonah, "What country are you from, and of what people?" And he says, "I am a Hebrew." Okay, by that time, that's very strange, because we're not reading anymore. It seems that there was a particular period where all of a sudden this kind of peters out and just disappears from use. So if you go back to Genesis 10, which I'm not asking you to turn there, we're just going to talk about this for a second, and you read what we call the Table of Nations, but you start in Genesis 10 with the descendants of Shem. And remember, we broke the sons of Noah into 3 categories, and we focus specifically on the line of Shem because that is where we get Semitic from, which, by the way, I'm just going to repeat this because it makes so many people mad. Semitic means Arab and others, not just, people tend to say anti-Semitic. In this day and age, it's met with only designed to reference people who are saying things that other people find unsavory towards the Jewish people. But in the Bible, there are Arab Semites as well. Wow, okay. So in the line of Shem, I know sometimes I just have to calm myself, but in the line of Shem, if you start going down that line, that is the line that descends to Christ, we read of Eber. And we are English readers, so it's not clearly visible, but that name, Eber, the reference of that name and the mention of that name has to do with the people that crossed over. And that is a reference to the people that crossed over from the Euphrates. So if you look at a map and you look at where Abram came from, Abram comes from Ur, and Ur actually kind of is on both sides of the Euphrates. So it's safe to say that a man like Abram crossed over the Euphrates and made his journey to the land where God guided him. So this name really has more to do with the people that crossed over, that are descendants of Eber, that are descendants of Shem, that lead us down that line. So Eber and that line brings us, of course, to Abram. And I've already kind of touched on this. So it's important to understand, even in Genesis 14:13, Abram is referred to as Abram the Hebrew, the man who crossed over, the people who came from the other side. And we're talking about the Euphrates, not the parallel world or something. You know, oh, what's she talking about? All right. So this is why, actually, now I'm going to get into something that most people don't have access to, but I'm just going to touch on it. And then you can see if you want to look it up. And I always tell you, look up what I'm saying. If you want to look up, this might be a little bit more challenging. But the reason to make clear these two words, Hebrew and Israelite, is that there are certain antiquities that reveal a clear distinction for those who were inscribing, carving, or writing between the two. There are 9 or 10 Egyptian texts that identify the people that we're talking about. I'm going to write it in English letters. And I'm going to put some brackets here, which are not terribly appealing. But that would be the transliteration of what we find in Egyptian writing to denote the people. And by the way, this letter right here makes it plural. And remember that their P and B are somewhat interchangeable depending on the pronunciation and if there's a vowel which comes later. So this could have been Ipir, Ibir. It could have been like we read Ibiri. There's a lot of morphing on this, but this particular word is found on at least 9 or 10 Egyptian texts that identify a people within the text. And if you want the hieroglyphics for this, it's a human arm representing the glottal stop, which is our, right, that sound, very beautiful. A foot and lower leg for the bur or the pur, and the vav-like symbol, which is actually clearly in Egyptian, actually looks like a vav, but it's not, it's a W. Well, we're using it for plural. It probably is one and the same with Hebrew and Aramaic. But here's the thing. There are examples on 2 of these rock stone steles at Beth Shan that indicate that Seti I, look this up, had encountered these people that we'll call them the Ipiri or the Ipiru. He references that there was a revolt, these particular people. In the 15th century BC, there's a mention of a capture of the same people. And again, in the 12th century, Ramses III refers to the same people being captured, taken prisoner, and presented to the temple for sacrifice. All right, we also find this same Egyptian word in the quarries of Wadi Hamat, but by the 11th century BC, they simply just disappear from Egyptian material and inscriptions. We do glean from the Tel El Armana letters that Pharaoh fought these people, and the correspondence of the court of Amemphis III and Enomis IV, referring to the Hapiru or the Habiru or the Habiri, Hebrews, the cuneiform texts agree. And so when you kind of put all this together, it's very clear because there are other references to these people in the later writings within Egyptian inscriptions that will refer specifically to what are clearly references to the sons of Israel or the sons of Jacob or the sons of Sak versus these Ibiru people. So clearly there is a distinction there in the secular writings. So As I said, by about the late end of the second millennium, everything just kind of fades away and disappears, and you will not see another reference after that in inscriptions, papyrus, or anything else. So it's not possible, by the way, for me to exhaust this subject in 1 hour. It's just not possible. But there is a purpose for me putting this out here. And that is too many people who do not have a linguistic background and they're not interested in archaeology and all these other things will just kind of take everything and put it in one pot and say, and that's that. It's not as simple as that. It's just not. So why did I spend all this time giving you all this backdrop? There's a reason, there's a purpose, because I want to make something really clear today. And I pray that God helps me right now, because this could get very lost. We know that Moses was born of mother and father from the tribe of Levi, and that these people are of the lineage of Jacob, who is Israel. So they're Israelites, and they are Hebrews. That's pretty clear, right? And they're from the tribe of Levi, so we've just covered all of these things. Now, in connection with this, think about this. So Moses, really, there's no way that Moses could have known the Hebrew or Levite roots, because as a child, he's just placed in a basket to spare his life, and there's no way that he could have, maybe God placed it in his heart or something. There's no way. He wasn't raised up with concepts that we would say are understood in religious practices today. First of all, it didn't exist. There may have been, from the parents, words spoken of maybe the God that was the God of their fathers. But there's no clarity. I mean, if you read the passage, there's no way to extrapolate somehow that, you know, these people had a certain practice. They're simply referred to as Hebrews living in Egypt. And we know that Moses, while he is raised in the palace, at a later time, he slays an Egyptian, ends up running away and living on the backside of the desert for 40 years in Midian. All common knowledge, right? Well, that takes us to Exodus 18. And now you're going to see that there's purpose sometimes. It takes me a long time to set up, but there's purpose in this. So let's take a look here. Exodus 18. When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons. Let me just stop right there. So the reason why I'm honing in on this is that this is going to, again, probably make a lot of people mad, but hey, that's what I do really good, right? We're going to find this Jethro. We encounter him a little bit earlier under another name. His name is Reuel, but he is priest of Midian. And Moses, as we just read clearly there, ends up taking a wife of the daughters of Jethro or Reuel. So Midian, oh boy, wait for it. Midian was a descendant of Abram through his second wife, right? So after Sarah dies, Abraham takes another wife. That wife's name is Keturah. Jethro is a descendant of that line. So don't conflate. Some people have conflated and put Jethro and the Midianites in the Ishmaelite line. He is not. Ishmael was a product of Hagar, not Sarah, right? Okay. So Jethro is a descendant of Midian. That makes him, oh, suck in your breath, it makes him half Hebrew by way of Abram's lineage, as well as Semite because of Shem, but he is not an Israelite. Does that make sense? You sure? Okay, because a lot of people are going to get lost here, I'm sure. So Jethro is not part of the tribes or the clans of the children of Israel in no way, shape, or form. Now, Moses marries Jethro's daughter named Zipporah, and I ask you to be very careful, because even the best of us can conflate things. How many of you have read the passage in Numbers where Miriam's just having a meltdown over Moses' wife and calls her an Ethiopian? a Cushite. Well, let me just tell you something. That has to be Moses' second wife. Why do I say that? Because we can trace the lineage of Midian, Jethro, and his children, and they are Arabian, but they are not Ethiopic or Cushite per se. There's a distinction there. Just, you go check that out on your own time, because I know people say, oh, but it's one and the same. It's not. Moses has 2 sons with Zipporah, Gershom and Eliezer. And, you know, if you think about it, now I'm going to get into the weeds of things that, as I said, people are not going to like. So, you know, I'm doing a lot of people out there a favor in TV land by saying that there was no Judaism at this time, because there was none. Because if there was, you all out there have a big problem. Moses, if you're going to do this the way everybody does it and say, well, it's about the mother and it's matriarchal. Zipporah is not a child of part of the lineage of Israel, number one. She is a Semite, but she's not in the proper lineage. She does not belong to any of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. So, technically speaking, she would be considered pagan. Do you see where I'm going? Some of you do. So then Moses married a woman who was not an Israelite, had no bloodline, and the best we can say is that she bore these 2 boys, half Hebrew and half Arabian. Semite, for sure, but that's all. And you could say, well, doesn't what Moses brings to the table count? Yeah, it would be a fraction. But again, there is a reason why Moses' sons are not, they don't get the baton passed to them. See, there's things in here that if you're not reading it carefully, you're going to say, well, that's interesting. Moses is living basically in a pagan land with pagan people. So when people try to make the argument, this modern argument that's just surfaced, that is everywhere, any commentary you read, most of them will say, well, the Jewish people at this time, Moses the Jew. Please, listen to what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is out of the Bible we're all reading. The land of Midian was not a land, even though they are Semites, there are a plethora of gods being worshipped there, not monotheistic, but polytheistic. And I'll point and tell you why. But I'm just going to point these out in bullet points. So the Jewish religion did not exist at this time. The Torah did not exist in men's hands or in men's mind, only in the heart of God. It was not yet given. And when we read chapter 18, we'll start at about verse 7. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, did obeisance, kissed him. They asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. Listen to the response. Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Here it comes. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. So it's interesting. He makes this, now I know he's above every god. That's why I told you they worshipped multiple gods in Midian. Make no mistake about it. So for 40 years while Moses is living in Midian, he is surrounded by polytheistic worship. Again, when people, it's cringeworthy when people say, oh, well, you know, they were Jewish. No, stop. They were not. I'm showing you something that anybody who is honest is going to read this and say, you're right, that's what's there. Don't invent something and put it and make an application that's not there. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Now, you might say, wow, Moses came back And he's telling Jethro, man, you should have seen it. You should have seen what this wonderful God did in slaying the firstborn and giving us favor to have all the goods and all the gold and all the stuff that we got from the Egyptians, and how God parted the sea and how he made water to come from a rock and how he fed the, imagine because I'm sure that it's a lot more than just 2 verses of, hey, right? There's a lot more detail we don't get. And 2 things happen. Jethro says, now I know this is a God above all the gods, does something that is very characteristic in the Old Testament before the law, which is to offer a burnt offering and sacrifices, a customary thing within the pages of the Bible, but customary also among pagans. So don't make this like, oh, this is some special worship practice. It is called a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, not for gods. So there had to be intent there, like a thank you or a votive offering. But lest you get too carried away with what I'm telling you, go to the end of the 18th chapter. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. Bye. Bye-bye, right? Now, if Jethro had really been gripped by everything that was said, there's a really strong likelihood that Jethro would have stayed along for the ride with these people. Now I know that the Lord is above all these gods. I'm going to offer a burnt offering and sacrifice, but I'm still going to go back to my land and do my own thing. And there's so many messages. I told you there's too many messages in here, so it's very difficult to stay focused. This one hits home for me. How many of you have ever talked to somebody about the goodness of the Lord? And they, wow, that's great, that's amazing. And then they just go right back to doing whatever it is that they were doing. So when I say to you, you can read the Old Testament and you can see that people have not changed. They have not changed. I'm sure that Jethro was wowed and impressed with everything Moses said, but it didn't have any impact for him to say, guys, I ain't going back to Midian. I got to stay with the tribe, right? That didn't happen. So, as I said, there's many lessons. This one basically should be a comfort to some of you who have people in your family, husbands or wives, sisters, brothers, anybody, any family member that just can't understand why you want to listen to God's word and why you go to church and why even bother. But they'll endure and put up with whatever you tell them as long as it's short, succinct, and you don't drone on about it. Oh, how that's great. Keep it to yourself, though. And that's kind of a little bit of how I read this. Now, we will never know. We will never know what happened to Jethro. It's possible that that day Jethro was so touched by God that he went back and somehow the people of Midian became believers. But I don't read of that. In fact, I read that they remained enemies. And this is the other twist in the story. When we consider Jethro's lineage descending as part of Israel's ancient enemies, it's kind of radical that I just want you to think about something. Moses married into one of the children of Israel's, not biggest, but one of their enemies. And this animosity will keep going. If you read, for example, in the book of Judges about Gideon, why is Gideon threshing wheat, but he's hiding, or he's hiding in the press? Why is he hiding? For fear of the Midianites. And if you keep going, there is a passage in Numbers 25:17. You know, this one's kind of, this is the stuff that people read and then they make all kinds of nutty comments on this. But Numbers 25, I think I said that, and 17. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Vex the Midianites and smite them, for they vex you with their wiles, wherewith they have beguiled you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of a prince of Midian, their sister, which was slain in the day of the plague of Peor, for Peor's sake. these people remained enemies. And God says, smite them. Just take them out. And this is what Moses married into. And I want you to think long and hard about this, because it's interesting that I don't think it was a mistake or an error that when Moses fled Egypt, I don't think he was just kind of, I'm wandering, I'm lost. He may have been, by the way, but I don't think so. I think the Lord led him as one who could have been instrumental in altering the course of Midianite history. Much like the people you come in contact with, for those few that you talk to and share your faith or your light is shining, that God gives that opportunity to alter their course by hearing something you've said. But they're not able. A lot of people are not able to do it. Just like Jethro, he goes, oh, that's great, and then just go back to his life. So there's a lot there. But the fact that Moses would find himself living for 40 years, 40 is the number of a complete time of testing, that he'd find himself living on the backside of the desert for 40 years, that he has a wife and children with what we'll call God's enemies. And I believe that there really was, I believe, a message there and a design. But again, this should kind of reveal to you that unless God is opening the hearts and minds, there is nothing that's going to change the people around you. Unless God is preveniently working on them, they're not going to hear and they can't receive. And that's just the way it is. And you might say, well, so what was the purpose of Moses going to the backside of the desert for 40 years? A complete time of testing, God preparing his heart, and God was gracious. God gave Moses a place to live, a family, and also, I think, during that time, understanding. Now, it's not clear to us that there's no passage that says, and then Moses deduced that these people were evil, but as time goes on, God is still revealing to Moses. We have some clear passages that these Midianites were just bad stuff for the children of Israel. So I think that we have all kind of had certain scenarios that are very, very familiar, at least I have, very familiar. Because there are times when I feel like I am a stranger in this world, like I don't belong here at times, and God helps me to understand we're just here for a time. And that another thing that I read and glean from Moses is that Moses went from great riches and wisdom of Egypt, of everything you could possibly want, to the lowest, most frowned upon profession of basically of shepherd. He becomes a shepherd of the people. And that was by God's design. Now, I'm not saying to you that every person who decides to serve God will be met with the test of giving up whatever they have, but I think there's a bigger message that we tend to forget. The New Testament talks of the man that asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And to that man, Jesus says, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And the man went away, very sorrowful. He would not, because he had a lot of goods and he didn't want to part with them. And I think the beauty of this story is that Moses left the comforts and the splendor of Egypt. Everything that you could possibly want was there. To go and live for 40 years in the backside of the desert, which I don't think was a walk in the park, to come out of that desert and go back to Egypt. Can you imagine what that must have taken psychologically? Just the strength to have once been a prominent person, and now you're going back as, in the eyes of those people, as some beggar schlep shepherd that, like, who the heck are you, right? For the ego of a human being, you might say that must have been very difficult, but the Bible speaks of Moses as meek, that's under God's control, and had a degree, obviously, of humility about him and understanding that this assignment he was on was something way bigger, even though he might not have understood it clearly, way bigger than himself. And that's what I'm asking you to think about today. There's so many lessons within this lesson. You know, just acknowledge the fact that sometimes your relatives, your friends, your family will not understand your faith. They'll say that's great and they don't want any part of it. They go their own way. that sometimes God puts us in situations that don't make sense. Like, why did God take all of this away to only put me here? And what does this mean? It may be an opportunity for you to discover and learn more about God's purposes in your life. And I'm not saying that as, oh, you know, we should all be happy when we get knocked down several pegs in life. I'm not saying that. But use those situations wisely, because it may just be, could be bad luck, but I don't think so. I think a lot of times stuff happens in God's perfect will and direction, and it's not always clear to us why. Do you really think that when Moses fled Egypt to the backside of the desert, do you think he even understood in his mind? He knew he was running so that they wouldn't kill him. He wouldn't be caught. He wouldn't face the consequences. But 40 years? So what do you think? Was Moses thinking, well, I'm just going to stay here and live out my life on the backside of the desert where no one knows me and no one will come for me? But God had a different plan. So in God's mind, it was like, oh, no, I'm going to do it this way. You ain't going to stay there permanently. I got a job for you. I got a mission for you. And I don't read anywhere that Moses said reluctantly, oh, okay, I mean, he didn't want to speak. He said, I can't speak. But I don't read anywhere where Moses said, you know, I can't do this thing. Thanks, God. He had obviously something placed on his heart during those 40 years to become the messenger, to listen and to follow, and to be the unique individual at this point in history that will basically lead a nation on a path of this unfolding drama of redemption that doesn't end in the desert, it ends at Calvary. So when people tend to look at this and they say, well, what are the lessons for me? It's all going to lead you to Christ if you're reading it right. And it's always going to have what I call secondary and tertiary lessons. And in this case, there's a whole bunch of them embedded in just this one message that says, don't get confused. God has a people he's set apart, yes, and that when we begin to homogenize the people that are being referenced, as I showed you, different people for different reasons. I just happen to believe I camped out on this Hebrew and Israelite concept to reveal something. If Moses, who indeed was from the tribe of Levi and was an Israelite and also a Hebrew, but married a woman who was not. So when we begin trying to get reality about this Bible, it's very human, it's very raw. Unfortunately, a lot of, I'd call them bad scholars, people who want to make something there that is not, have painted this in a completely different light. When you look at it carefully, it is really the beginning of understanding why God didn't want people commingling. He had singled out a people, this whole group. And this whole group, as we know, as I've taught on, will become literally a divided nation after the death of Solomon. And that divided nation to the north will literally disappear off the pages of the Bible and will appear on the pages of history as nomadic wanderers founding and making many claims to lands far, far away from the Levant. And the southern people, as we know, will get carried away into captivity for 70 years. And when they come back, it is upon their return we begin to see the emergence of Judaic practices. And you say, well, what were they doing in the desert? God was revealing a prescribed method to relate to him, which unfortunately, if you really think about it, and I've said this before, modern Judaism does not contain many of those practices. There is no burnt offering offered anymore. There are no blood sacrifices. There are not even any, if you think about it, there are no sacrifices being done. So how can people say, if they want to make this what happened in the desert, definitively Judaism, which it is not. It is a precursor to, it is the, we'll call it the prototype of what will become. And by the way, that prototype will only last for a small window. And by the time of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and by the first century, Judaism will be the Judaism that people want to refer to biblically will begin to disappear, and rabbinicism will begin to take its place. So when you read very carefully books like the Mishnah, you will begin to see a great departure from Scripture. And that, you can get mad at me, you can say, I don't like what you're saying, but investigate for yourselves. Do a little bit of digging, and you find out that a lot of things that you and I were told growing up, or that we just assumed and we believed because we heard somebody else say it, may not actually be true. What does that mean? It means that we have a lot more studying to do. It means, just like Moses, I can say for Moses, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, just as our steps are ordered by the Lord to show us, to reveal us, to point us in a direction of greater understanding. And what is the minute details that I did today? What does that do? It gives clarity. You might say, well, I'm confused. Then hold that thought. I'll come back to it. But for those of you who know what I just did today, it completely debunks the idea of matriarchal relations being prominent, because if that were so, you could never count the offspring of Moses just by virtue of the way people in modern days reckon Judaism. That's number one. Number two, that Moses married into the ancient enemies of God, probably for a purpose that didn't come to fruition. And lastly, that in everything that happened here, God was constantly, as he is today, revealing that there are deeper meanings and lessons for us to glean. So don't say, I know this passage, I've read it many times, because even some of us have managed to do this magnificent blending of things and just put it as one group of people doing one thing. No, there's a lot more here. Hopefully the Lord will enable me to explain it in greater detail, but I hope at least for now the point has been made, the message is received, and if you leave here with nothing else, I want you to think of Jethro receiving Moses' wonderful, amazing news, kind of like what we do when we first come to the faith and we're so giddy and excited, and the people around you are like, yeah, that's great, and they just go their own way. That right there is a template to tell you that don't think you're unique. It happens to all of us. It even happened to Moses, the man who would deliver a whole bunch of people somehow, but couldn't deliver his own father-in-law. So for many of you, because I read your letters, I know you've got, some of you have husbands, wives, people in your family that just think you're a nut or don't believe. Take comfort in what I just said today, because at the end of the day, you could make any decision you want on what happened to Jethro. I'm going to choose to say that because we don't hear of him again and the Midianites remain enemies, that there's a very good chance he just went back home to his pagan gods, comfort and nothing more, nothing less. So I can't say anything else except that. Hopefully it all starts to make sense. This certainly is to be continued, but for right now, that's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.